Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final Oxford Minds lecture series for this term. I was a little bit out last week when I introduced last week's as the final, my diary mess ups. But welcome to tonight's lecture on belonging. Hugely excited for this one. As I've mentioned at the beginning of most of the lectures, Alex and I developed this series to try and counteract the things that were happening with the pandemic. You know, we weren't able to meet in person, we weren't able to have dinners, we weren't able to meet the great minds of Oxford like you ordinarily would. So we wanted to bring them to you, and tonight's lecture is no exception. It's very, very exciting, this lecture series, and I am not going to talk anymore. We're just going to get straight into it. So I'm going to hand over to Alex to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Susan. Many of our lectures have drawn upon external speakers from outside Oxford. And this evening we're moving outside the Social Sciences division, but not outside Oxford. Professor Elleke Boehmer is joining us from the Humanities division, where she's Professor of World Literature in English. She's based in the English department. She's a fellow of Wolfson College. And in this term series, we're exploring themes that are particularly relevant to the social sciences. So we've covered power, space, identity, and now we're moving on to belonging. And what we really wanted to be able to do was reach out to the humanities to explore some of the themes that really matter today, the intersections of colonialism, race, gender, and the way they shape inclusion and exclusion and belonging. And I think one of the themes that runs through Professor Boehmer's work, both her academic work and her work as an acclaimed writer of fiction, is thinking critically about the historical and cultural underpinnings of structures of racial inclusion and exclusion, gender-based exclusion and inclusion, and the intersection across these facets of culture, ideas, and history, particularly as they structure the post-colonial world. Professor Boehmer is one of the founding and leading figures in post-colonial studies. Her work, amongst many other themes, focuses on empire and resistance to empire and its legacies around the world. Her academic work covers a broad array of topics and themes. Her published work includes colonial and post-colonial literature, migrant metaphors, empire, the national and the post-colonial, 1890 to 1920, stories of women, gender and narrative in the post-colonial nations, and a very short introduction about Nelson Mandela. And her prize-winning novels include Bloodlines, An Immaculate Figure, and most recently, a collection of short stories, To the Volcano and Other Stories. It's a real delight to have this opportunity to explore these themes in ways that cut across the social sciences and the humanities in a way that so much of the work of our graduate students also does. So Professor Boehmer, thank you for joining us during your sabbatical, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex, for that warm introduction. It's a great honor and privilege to speak in the Oxford Minds series. I'm really delighted to speak on a topic very close to my heart and to many of my concerns, both academic and creative, which is belonging. And of course, as you were just mentioning there, Alex, belonging intersects with those other major topics that you've been covering this term: power, space, and identity. So I begin then with one of the landscapes of my belonging. It's one that some of you may recognize. It's from the Vale of the White Horse near Uffington here in Oxfordshire. I will weave landscapes into this talk as I go. But a word before I launch in, a word on my subtitle. Belonging is the main title, and the subtitle, What the Humanities Have to Teach the Social Sciences. And I want to explore this today through both practice and demonstration, which means for me through reading. What I want to do is to talk about literary texts, primarily, in fact, literary texts, as themselves providing ways to think about belonging, as ways of theorizing belonging, and so too, as will become clearer as I proceed, of thinking from the South. So I will tend not to cite theorists and apply their insights to texts as I do in some of my other work. Rather, I will draw upon literary texts, which involve us at so many quantifiable and unquantifiable levels to generate insights on this topic of belonging. Just a quick word on structure so that you know where I am, what to expect. I find this is often quite helpful in these talks online. The talk falls into three rough parts. The first is quite short and definitional. The second looks at belonging, but in particular at challenges and interruptions to belonging involved in empire and migration. And the third will involve a necessarily short reading that will try to demonstrate a little of what I've been trying to say. So the first short definitional part, some working definitions. Belonging, if we break the word down, we can see that it refers to being and feeling. It's a feeling about being. But in its plural form of belongings, it also signifies, of course, ownership. Those are my belongings. That belongs to me. And putting these connotations, these meanings together, being, feeling, and ownership, we come to affinity, which is where the OED locates the definition, affinity for a place or a situation. And expanding from that then, affinity and or the feeling of being part of or linked to a certain place or group. And often this comes to feelings of belonging to a nation, to the situation of nations or a nation. Belonging then implies a context. We belong together, where community, togetherness is our context. They belong there. Now, why do works of art, including pieces of literature, literary texts, come into questions of belonging? For many people, in fact, I would go so far as to claim for all of us, that feeling of belonging is often captured in or evoked by a work of art, be it a piece of music. Actually, music resonates particularly strongly in this regard, but also an image, an icon, a poem, a song. Think of national anthems or of pop songs that are evocative of certain times of life. This is the Desert Island Discs principle. Certain songs or pieces of music that capture something, a feeling, an atmosphere about a particular time of life. Poems, texts, songs then evoke, capture that feeling of understated connectedness, as when we hear this poem by Edward Thomas, a poem beloved by many here in the British Isles, in particular in England, in this context, one that you may well have heard, read often at funerals, actually, is where I've most encountered it. It's a poem that raises strong connotations in a very, very understated way of belonging for people in this context. In this very quiet poem, Edward Thomas captures a moment in an uneventful journey that, however, many readers have felt speaks to them profoundly. This may have something to do with the speaking voice, the lyric voice that we hear in the poem, the individual perspective that then gets absorbed, taken up into the atmosphere and the natural context, and so feels that it belongs, it is woven in, it's knitted in. And to recognize the poem and to try to capture something perhaps of that feeling, and it will be interesting to hear from people how it resonated for you. I will read it. I was only able to squeeze the 12 lines, but it is on the slide, but it is actually a 16-line poem. Yes, I remember Adelstrup, the name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwontedly. It was late June. The steam hissed. Someone cleared his throat. No one left and no one came on the bare platform. What I saw was Adelstrup, only the name, and willows, willow herb, and grass, and meadow sweet, and haycocks dry. No whit less still and lonely fair than the high cloudlets in the sky. And for that minute a blackbird sang close by, and round him mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. But now to change tack for a moment, to move away from England, although that begs a question. Belonging, however, comes to a point of crisis, which is where my research comes into it, when people are for some reason removed from their land, tradition, or context, or these from them. And this happens and has happened in many situations of empire and its aftermaths, of invasion, war, dispossession, migration. In a world shaped by empire, migration, and resistances to movement, these questions of belonging, where we belong, and where we are denied belonging, become especially salient and often very difficult. And hence, this is where literary texts come back in, hence how literary texts, works of art, poems, songs, provide a repository and a channel for those feelings, and in some situations might do compensatory or reparative work of their own, becomes especially pressing. And that idea of these works doing compensatory or reparative work of their own, accounting for our belonging, is something that threads throughout this talk. In brief, then, we use stories to account for our belonging, to knit it up. This, I hope, is not to instrumentalize literature or music. It is to tell stories, sing songs, as cultures have always done. These stories place us in the context to which we feel we belong, or hope to belong, or re-belong in those situations of rupture and dispossession that I'm also trying to draw attention to. Stories in these contexts offer shelter, can be imagined to offer shelter, fireplaces, venues to come together. Or, as the Indigenous Australian writer Alexis Wright observes in a novel, Carpentaria, that I will come back to at the end of the talk, luckily, the ghosts in the memories of the old folk were listening and said, anyone can find hope in the stories, the big stories, and the little ones in between. And significantly, Carpentaria is in part a story, a tragedy really, of dispossession. And it explores ways of refinding belonging. According to the United Nations, some upwards of 100 million people in the world today qualify as migrants, live in states of unbelonging. The situations of rootlessness that developed in the growing cities of the early 20th century have now become pervasive across the world and have been for some time in this war-torn 21st century. Which is why claims of belonging, you here, me there, or us here together or not, divided, are so salient, as for example, in the very powerful work of Carol Phillips, a British writer born in St. Kitts in the Caribbean, who has written urgently, repeatedly, resonantly, and in dialogue, interestingly, with an English tradition of writing about belonging and unbelonging across his career, across the past 30 years or so. And not surprisingly, to draw on a sampling of other texts, not surprisingly, across post-colonial space, we don't have to look far for novels preoccupied with belonging, indeed, whose titles in these cases take the word belonging in the title. We have, for example, Joan Riley's 1985, The Unbelonging, another story of Black British separation from roots, the sense of being unhomed in England, which, however, was aspired to as a mother country by one's parents. Or Half a World Away, Sia Figel's very, very forceful Where We Once Belonged from Samoa, an absolutely key work of charting belonging and unbelonging in her space, in her island of Samoa, in which she grapples with the ways in which people, and in particular young women, young Samoan women, were described by Western anthropologists. Or again, more recently, Uma Sinha's Belonging, which is a story of shifting home, shifting space from the Indian subcontinent to England. And that's just a sampling. I'd now like to move into the situation of unbelonging, feeling unmoored from a tradition or a culture, the condition, in short, of colonized minds. In any colonial or migrant situation where separation from a familiar context, home, has occurred and a sense of belonging is suspended, even the materials or medium available for self-fashioning, for trying to recreate belonging, might seem alien. You see that link there between selfhood and belonging that we were thinking about earlier. Now, why is this so? Why is the sense of belonging suspended? Well, in part, but in large part, because the languages, concepts, traditions, books, cultural forms that provide the lens or medium through which such reconstruction of belonging might take place are in fact alien to the self, come from elsewhere. What are some of these cultural forms? Well, ideas of the nation itself, the concept of individual identity or selfhood, perhaps, ideas of civilization and who is civilized. And this produces the powerful need to decolonize the mind, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o put it several decades ago already in a very powerful book, Decolonizing the Mind. This produces the need to find new or renewed ways to belong. So in effect, I suppose what I'm saying here is to try to pull this together, is that decolonization may well mean re-belonging, find renewed ways to belong, whether in a culture, in a context, in a tradition, in a space. Why are the instruments, the means through which we might renew belonging so distanced and alien or alienated in post-colonial or migrant situations? Well, this is in part because of education, because of what is taught as central and what is dismissed as peripheral. Any number of post-colonial writers have reflected on this situation of unbelonging impacted by a colonial education in their own craft and practice. And here again, I have just a sampling taken from some of the Caribbean writers I deeply admire. Here is Derek Walcott remarking on his education in St. Lucia, colonial St. Lucia. In those balmy days, I was not English, but I considered myself to be. I was colonial, but did not consider myself to be so. England belonged to me, her heritage, her war. So he's expressing a feeling of belonging to England, at that time to him a completely alien space, to the same extent really as Edward Thomas was expressing in the poem Adelstrup. Or here's Jamaica Kincaid on her colonial education on Antigua, another island in the Caribbean. She says, she's talking about English Romantic poetry, and she describes it, the poetry of Wordsworth, as a perfection which one longed for. And of course, the perfection one longed for was England. I longed for England myself. These things were a big influence, and it was important for me to get rid of them. Then I could actually look at the place I am from, Antigua. Or V.S. Naipaul, speaking from a rather different but still Caribbean cultural background in Trinidad. He observes in his amazing The Enigma of Arrival, and he's talking about arriving and finding a home in a new land, England, that as a young man in Trinidad, he knew of the lowing herd of cattle winding o'er the lea from Gray's famous Elegy, a late 18th century poem, often prescribed on the syllabus in the Caribbean and Trinidad. So he knew of this image from the poem, but the cows he had in mind that he saw in his imagination were those featured on condensed milk tins. We had no herds like that on my island, he writes. So his belonging is being figured through images of English cows. Again, there's that sense of alienation from one's own contexts, as the traditions and the landscapes to which his education has taught him to belong bear no relationship to the social and cultural world around him. Or switching context entirely just to demonstrate that this goes on. The Walcott, Kincaid, and Naipaul statements are all sort of 50s to 1980s. But I'd like to draw your attention also to the really astonishing and urgent work of the Kenyan writer who died a few years ago, Binyavanga Wainaina, writer and activist, who in talk after talk and speech after speech, you can find these on YouTube, I strongly recommend them, has spoken of the self-alienation of Kenyan school children, because the stories that they grow up with, that they're taught to respect in school, are not from their own culture. The stories have been brought in through the medium of a still colonial education, as he says. So the situation that Ngugi wa Thiong'o was describing in Kenya in the 1980s, that the situation of colonized minds, is something that Binyavanga Wainaina was detecting even today in the 2010s. So this brings us to what I call a post-colonial paradox, perhaps for me, the post-colonial paradox, that many migrant writers, activists, researchers, writers come up against. That those who seek to reconstruct belonging often find themselves positioned between different cultural worlds. They're able to borrow from several traditions, so that is a situation of fruitfulness, one might say. Yet in cultural and sometimes also in linguistic terms, they belong to no single one and inhabit, therefore, a condition of supplementarity. Now, in post-colonial studies in my field, this has sometimes, often perhaps, been described as a situation of hybridity, which is kind of quite a happy space, or implies a happy space, Whereas I think supplementarity has the connotations of in addition, of being spare and unhomed, that I'd like to emphasize in particular today. How then do we claim and reclaim our cultural integrity in migrant or even refugee situations? How do we find cultural coherence, dignity, and belonging where languages and cultural lifeways have been lost or displaced? How do we narrate a place of belonging removed from community, or indeed bereft of a tradition or a language? And here is a further aspect of the post-colonial paradox, that what we then do is that we recreate belonging through the medium of what does not belong to us, what may in some cases have been imposed upon us. And this raises a very interesting question of belonging as a fiction. It is both a need and a reality, a real feeling, and yet it is something that is evoked through and perpetuated by way of fictions of belonging. The anthropologist Benedict Anderson, who many of you, of course, will know about, talked about this some time ago, the idea of imagining community and imagining community together. Almost echoing him, the Ghanaian-Canadian writer Essie Idagyan observes that migrant writers like her are at one and the same time thinking about the fiction of belonging, but also, and therefore, constructing new fictions of belonging in their work. She writes, "The special territory of fiction is both a place and an idea, and this means standing by the power of stories to affect and to alter the realities of our world." And you may remember that quotation from Alexis Wright that we had a bit earlier about the stories as offering hope where we stand. And now I have just a few remarks without PowerPoint, and I'll just take you to another landscape, an Australian landscape, because we're moving steadily towards the discussion of Carpentaria. But before that, I just want to make a few more remarks about fictions of belonging. So what I suppose I'm wanting to say is that recognizing the fictiveness of belonging, even when it is, as I was saying, a visceral reality, may itself be a fruitful place from which to reconstruct that belonging. In fact, writers, poets, songwriters often make of their quest for belonging and even their loss of community and context a story. It struck me in preparing for this talk how many post-colonial novels and poems are stories of origin and return, of childhood, of separation from home and the places of childhood, and then of trying to recreate or relocate home and homecoming. The mode of renewal and return, of recuperation generally, remains crucial for writers in colonial and in post-colonial and decolonial contexts working today. We often see writers in these novels and poems retracing and rebuilding complicated networks of relations between individual and community, community and environment, individual and environment, landscape. Their novels and poems reconstruct traditions, memories, and stories that connect them back to that environment. These works tell stories of their relationship to place and to each other, as cultures have, of course, always done, and as we'll see in my case study in a moment. So stories, trying to pull this together, place us in the context to which we belong then, or hope to re-belong. They trace and retrace our networks to the extent that the story itself can become the place where belonging is, or where it is reenacted. Okay, so I'm making quite a big claim there, that the story itself becomes the place where belonging is reenacted, where it is felt again. As Marina Warner and others have suggested, ancient myths and stories, as they transmigrate into contemporary poetry and fiction, can offer new imaginative bearings for those displaced. These stories don't need to be well known. They don't need to be from great traditions. They only need to be retold. As we will find in a moment in Alexis Wright, stories from the song traditions of the peoples of the Gulf of Carpentaria not only give an account of their belonging in that space, but in the very process of being retraced and retold, those feelings of belonging are reanimated and live again. And here is where we all come in as readers. It is the act of reading that reactivates them. So we reconstruct these spaces in our imaginations as the writer writes them, as the writer tells them to us. In short then, and this is not a quote from Paul Gilroy, but this is an idea that he has helped me shape, that he has indeed offered us. Our belonging relates as much to recounting our roots, the roots of our travel, our movement and migration, as accounting for roots or origins. And now I'll try to momentarily, in very short space of time, to demonstrate some of this, the stories as recreating belonging in a short account of the novel Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. So what I want to do here is to demonstrate that a literary text, when read, and readers are the agents here, a literary text, this very long, deeply enchanting novel, can operate both as a site for and a medium of belonging for us readers. This is especially, of course, and this is important, where those readers feel community with the writer. There's a special community within a community there, but not only then. Now, I realize that some of this may feel a bit academic, as Carpentaria may not be a novel with which many people listening are familiar. But for those who are, you will appreciate the resonance of what I'm saying. Alexis Wright's Carpentaria is a powerful, often disturbing epic, as I was saying, set in the Gulf country of northwestern Queensland. The novel is constantly mindful and so reminds us, its readers, of how air, land, water, and people in this space interconnect in ways sometimes very similar to what Edward Thomas was describing, of his attention, as it were, being sucked up into the clouds and into the atmosphere. Reminds us in that way, but not only in that way, because it is also, this novel Carpentaria, very, very particular to its place. It reminds us of how these entities, these beings, people, land, water, connect through storms, the power of storms, through the flow of ocean currents, through travel, the movement of people across landscape, and of course, through the work of dreaming, through the work of the imagination. At key moments in the novel of death, threat, and revival, it's the story of a mining community and the threats that the mine poses to them, and how the indigenous community of Pricklebush fights back. And at key moments of death, threat, and then revival, the chronologies in the novel collapse in really interesting ways, as I suppose they do in myth-making and in ancient storytelling. also really important is that the environment, the place where the people belong or yearn to re-belong because the mind has dispossessed them, is always seen from within. The land is seen from within, with the eyes of the people, the eyes, interestingly, also of fish in the Gulf, in the sea, seen through the lenses of the stories that they are dreaming. It is something, the environment, that is constantly dynamic, fluid, interconnecting, interflowing. In Carpentaria, Alexis Wright draws us into the deep experience of belonging and unbelonging and then re-belonging that her community feels as Indigenous Australians living on land taken from them. Land torn apart, denuded and raped by mining. In doing so, she maps affinities with that place through myth and with place and with myth through place. So with place through myth and with myth through place. She taps in deep into Indigenous storytelling traditions that constantly recall the reader or listener to the links between people and other living entities, including the land and the sea. So we're losing language, and she's writing in English, not in Wanwi, her language. We're losing language has been another kind of colonial dispossession. We discover in this novel how telling stories from your own tradition, even if in English, a killer language, according to Wright and other Indigenous activists, even if in English, returns us to our history and to our place. The literature itself, the novel in this case, invites us to regenerate feelings of belonging and community. Indeed, it does so in involving us as readers. It regenerates feelings of being in the past and the present simultaneously, and so of claiming a place in the future inside the warp and the weft of the story and belonging again. And I will end with another landscape of my own belonging. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elleke. That was absolutely brilliant and fascinating to listen to from a social sciences perspective. If anyone in the audience would like to offer a question, please feel free to enter it. Susan, do you want to start with something?
Sure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. It was fascinating. And, you know, being an Australian living in England, I get a great sense of belonging and not belonging. I wanted to ask you a question, and this is, I apologize in advance for probably a very naive question, but when you were talking about the fictions that are written and the fictions that we write, I'm assuming that you purposely use the word fiction rather than narrative, because we hear that, you know, people say, oh, well, that's their narrative. A narrative that sort of has more of a, I suppose, a political or possibly a political connotation. I'm just wondering, you know, the purpose of it and your thoughts around the use of fiction rather than narrative.
I mean, yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting that you raise it. Two quick answers. I mean, I think normally I would use narrative. You know, narratology is something I'm deeply comfortable with. It was fictions of belonging. It was a direct quote from Essie Edagyan. And what she was doing, of course, is playing on the idea of the fiction of belonging, and then fictions, as in her own work, novels of belonging. That novels, something, you know, visceral and important to her, that represent work for her, also are, as it were, you know, invented things, you know. So it was that play, and that then allowed me to segue briefly to Benedict Anderson and imagined communities, and I suppose, you know, Hobsbawm and Ranger too, and ideas of invented tradition. So the word fiction allowed me to play with some of those connotations and meanings just to that point, and I did so through Edagyan. But yes, I mean, you know, for the word narrative is probably more conventional, and yes, probably has more of a political heft. But fiction also, I think, certainly for Edagyan in that talk from which I was quoting, she was talking about fiction as something involving work, you know, the work of writing.
Yep. Thank you.
Could I bring you back to one of your central claims, that the idea that the story itself becomes the place where belonging is reenacted? It made me wonder about what the characteristics are of the story that enables that, of the story that enables colonized minds to be overcome, transcended, resisted. And you partly answered that when you discussed Paul Gilroy's quote of it being as much about recounting roots as about accounting for roots with a different spelling of roots. But it made me think about, and here's the link between the humanities and the social sciences, the social context in which you think the right kinds of stories emerge, are told, and can be retold. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, if that's not too broad a question.
So Alex, just to try to get it right, you're asking about the context in which those stories can be told.
So what makes
the kinds of stories?
So it's in a way a question about the relationship to power. So what are the conditions under which stories that can achieve that can emerge and flourish and be resold and transcend the colonized mind? So what has to happen for these stories of rebelonging to emerge, flourish, and be successful? What's the non-literary, broader social context from your perspective, from the perspective of your work and how you see it from literary theory, from literature, that allows that to flourish and those decolonizing and post-colonial authors to have wider effects on communities, culture, and society?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and a very necessary one. I mean, one of the contexts which was implicit in the slides in which I was talking about education is the classroom. That is an absolutely crucial space where a different kind of story needs to be told, you know. And I mean, I'm not saying that isn't already happening. I mean, you know, it wasn't a doom and gloom thing that I was referring to, but more of it needs to happen, certainly. I mean, that's the process of decolonization that we're all preoccupied with. So one venue is the classroom, but then, you know, the venues may also be the refugee camp, the refugee situation, and what might be the spark for this retelling to take place. It might be the situation of being asked what your story is. I mean, this is, you know, a crucial question often asked of refugees. You know, what is your story? What is the story that brings you from, you know, where you come from to here? And often that story is difficult to tell. And in those contexts, actually other stories may come in as useful. You know, as I was saying, stories from tradition, they don't need to be, you know, great tradition. They don't need to be well-known stories. But, you know, there may be stories remembered from childhood. There may be stories drawn from history. There may be the stories of, you know, familiar heroes, or even people on social media. And having mentioned social media, interestingly, social media is often a context in which these stories can be shared and retold and disseminated. So there are three venues. They're all completely different, and if you like, the the motivating impulse for the stories in those different contexts are often completely different too. So classroom, refugee camp, social media. I'm involved in a project at the moment mainly with social scientists, actually, the Accelerate Hub based in the Social Policy Institute here and at UCT, in which we are exploring interventions to help improve the lives of young people across the African continent. And what we're very interested in finding out is how those interventions may land with these young people, so how they perceive them, you know, how that intervention is interpreted in their context. And that's where storytelling comes in crucially, because it for those young people to tell how that intervention lands, how they perceive it, or what's going on in their lives, allows us to understand whether the thing that we're bringing is working or not.
Fascinating, thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. After all this time, you think you'd get used to it, but we still get stuck.
I never do.
So we've got a couple of questions from audience members, a question and then a comment. The question is, you mentioned stories and myths that migrants create for belonging. How important is the role of archetypes in this? What archetypes would migrants resort to in order to make sense of selfhood, psyche, and belonging?
Oh, great question. How important are archetypes in this? Absolutely crucial. I mean, by archetypes, I already used the word heroes. By archetypes, we're talking about the kind of the dominant patterns in stories that often get repeated across cultures. You know, the archetypes of the seeker, the traveler, the homemaker, the eldest child, the youngest child. I mean, these are the building blocks of iconic stories, and even of, you know, ordinary stories such as we might share on social media. So yes, I would say that the archetypes are very, very important. What's also interesting is how freeing those archetypes or hero figures, those stories of those familiar stories of those hero figures can often be, because they allow us to tell things about ourselves, but through the medium of a character, not ourselves. You know, it allows us to displace ourselves from the situation we may be in, to nonetheless, perhaps through a kind of code, the code of the archetype, we could call it, tell something about ourselves. Because, you know, the personal voice, that very intense, intimate personal voice that Edward Thomas uses with such facility in that poem Adolstrup at the beginning of the talk, it's a cultural construct. It's something that's really quite, it has to be acquired, and it's quite difficult to acquire. So often the stories of, you know, the wandering hero, or the two brothers, you know, the good brother and the bad brother, for argument's sake, the good Samaritan who, you know, who reclaims him, is reclaimed by his community. Those stories allow us to free ourselves from the intimate voice, which is often quite difficult.
The same attendee has made a comment, and I wonder whether you'd like to come back on it. They've said, I disagree with the use, sorry, I'm going to need to put my glasses on. I disagree with the use of the term rootless, as migrants, refugees have embedded roots in their native places, and the roots are simply stretched to a breaking point. The pull of those roots leads to creation of stories to ease the pain. I believe the presence of those roots are felt, and that is why diasporic communities tend to draw more towards tradition than the native communities who stay in the native land.
So the displaced communities draw more upon tradition, is what the question is saying. Yes, I mean, could I just say that I don't think use the term rootlessness. It's not actually a term that I particularly agree with or espouse. I absolutely agree that roots can be stretched to breaking point, but I don't think that anyone is rootless. We all have memories of our childhoods or of homes we once occupied, family members we once knew, which are, you know, which serve as our roots, absolutely. I mean, often when we are separated from those places and spaces of belonging, yes, the stories are the more poignant because the stories become portmanteau. You know, they become the luggage, through which our cultural connections and our memories are transported. We bring them with us through the stories. So often the stories, this is why Marina Warner uses an interesting word, shelter, for stories. Often the stories for people who may be displaced geographically from where they were born or come from, the stories are the place where those really important things are held. And that is why, to quote the question, that is why stories so powerfully help to heal the pain.
We've got another question that's come from an audience member, Juliet, and it says, regarding your point on archetypes, might these archetypes create boxes, in inverted commas, in the canon that crowd out the authentic lived experiences of migrant groups? Or might these archetypes become narratives of victimization? And how can this be prevented?
Wow, great question. I know I'm not going to be able to do it justice. It's a, you know, it's huge. Archetypes can be, I suppose, I mean, in answer to the first point about boxes, archetypes can be reshaped, repossessed, reframed, reinvented. So in that case, they may be, you know, we may be able to insinuate our own stories into the gaps and cracks. Derek Walcott, actually, who I referred to earlier, talks about, you know, broken vases, the broken bits of the Caribbean archipelago that he kind of equates with or correlates with the broken pieces of different traditions from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas that have come to him as a poet, you know, and because, you know, he's not able to possess them entirely or wholly because partly because they've been transported, partly because he has been framed as alien to them. But nonetheless, by rearranging their brokenness as with a mosaic, he is able, he you know, in his work, he is able to kind of, you know, tell different stories, tell his own stories, the story of his island and his island belonging. So yes, I mean, the archetypes, they are portmanteau, but yes, they are sometimes exclusionary. But that doesn't mean we can't. I mean, this is the amazing, malleable, plastic power of storytelling. We can, and language, as in poetry or song, we can reshape it anew. We can reshape it to fit our own lives and stories.
I also wanted to ask you about the stories of the powerful, as it were. So I suppose one of the kind of common tropes of the last few years is that the crisis of belonging in the rich world of the historical colonizers in the UK, in the United States, in the sort of colonial metropoles, and that sense of what belonging means in Britain and elsewhere in historical seats of power. And I wondered if you see, when you look across sort of emerging literature, whether you see sort of strands of crisis in the stories of belonging that are being told in what constitutes British identity, and whether you see different threads of how belonging is discussed, contested, and narrated than you find in the sort of core focus of your work, which is the post-colonial context.
Again, it's a really great question, Alex. I mean, yes, I detect those cracks of crisis running kind of throughout British writing and culture today, or English writing and culture. The picture's very, very different in Scotland, for example. And it's so interesting that Edward Thomas was, of course, Welsh by origin and wrote that sort of quintessential poem of Englishness. Those cracks and kind of the intimations of crisis come through, I find. I mean, this is a huge question. I'd love to talk a lot more about it, but they come through. I detect it in a tone of anxious reassertion, of pressing certain definitions of Englishness too hard. You know, I mean, actually, we've seen some very interesting demonstrations of this, not in the novel, not in kind of, you know, in literary form, but on our television screens in the last few days. You know, debates about arguments, fierce, heated arguments about the signification of the Queen, you know, the signifier of Queen, the story of the Queen. The crown is fascinating in what it's trying to say about Englishness and about, you know, crises of who belongs on these islands. That, you know, I mean, you will all gather that I'm referring to a certain interesting interview that was on our television screens a couple of days ago. That was all about belonging and the fissures of unbelonging that are being experienced, you know, I was going to say in the British Isles, I will say in England today. I mean, but there's so much to say. I'm kind of going all over the place with the answer. It's a great question.
I really love the idea of anxious reassertion, which I think captures a lot of what's going on in contemporary England. I think we're pretty close to time. So I really just want to say a massive thank you for making time. I know this is your sabbatical, that you're focusing on your next research project, albeit not from the field locations you hope to be in, but from Oxford. This has been massively inspiring and a really thought-provoking way to start our discussions on belonging that will continue with the panel session next week. So just a massive thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
It was brilliant. Thank you.